During the 1980s, U2 became one of the most critically and commercially successful acts in rock music. However, by the end of the decade, their puritanical approach to both music and performance was beginning to wear thin. It was clear that unless they could reinvent themselves, U2 would be destined to become a heritage act. Their salvation was to come in the form of Achtung Baby.
Achtung Baby feels like the hinge, the exact, as it were, creative midpoint.
I think it's a record that's grown in its importance because of the place that it occupies in what we now know as U2's history.
It somehow still sounds very vibrant and very contemporary, and I think will continue to stand as one of the landmarks of their career.
The album Achtung Baby was the reinvention that U2 so desperately needed. This film is a review of that record, its history and the band who made it.
We drank the wine, everybody having a good time.
The band that would become U2 formed in Dublin during the mid-1970s. They initially came together after Larry Mullen placed an advertisement on their school notice board. The group's lineup quickly solidified, with Bono on rhythm guitar and vocals, The Edge on lead guitar, Adam Clayton on bass, and Mullen on drums.
In the late 1970s, forming a punk rock group in Dublin, you had to kind of make it up as you went along, and they did, and they came up with a very odd, unorthodox sound. I mean, you could pin it to sort of various American new wave acts, like Television in particular, obviously a big influence, but they were very much their own thing. They didn't really sound like quite anybody else.
They were going back to, as it were, the exciting guitar styles of the late 1960s, which had been sort of reduced by the years era of punk to being somehow regarded as sort of arty and wanky and not the sort of thing that kind of proper punk guitarists should be getting involved with.
U2 were one of the first bands to sort of reclaim traditional rock and roll values, if you like, and to weld them to the mood of the early 80s and that whole post-punk sensibility.
By 1980, they were signed to Island Records. They released a series of 4 studio albums that became increasingly popular. By the end of 1984, U2 were a well-regarded and successful group on both sides of the Atlantic. However, it was to be a single performance in the July of 1985 that would best define the early part of their career.
Live Aid was the defining moment of the first phase of their career, where they'd made a series of albums that had gradually been articulating different themes and becoming bigger and more anthemic musically. And in that arena, they really found their size and their stage.
The charismatic thing was Bono going out in the crowd, and he picked out a girl. It came over well. And of course, in popular entertainment, appearance counts for at least as much as substance, at least in something which is making instant impact like that.
Their performance that day was one of the highlights of the day because of that, and because it broke down the barrier between the stars on stage and the people at the event, made it seem a lot more human, even though it was on this massive scale.
After their success at Live Aid, U2 were poised to become one of the most important and popular acts of the 1980s.
Fans began to embrace their sound. Their sound also tended to become a little bit more anthemic.
It was only kind of the middle part of their career that they started to get more anthemic, and along with albums like War, where they became more aggressive and they were waving their white flags. And like many of those bands then, they kind of developed into this kind of stadium sound. And the Joshua Tree then was the record that kind of solidified that.
In 1985, Rolling Stone magazine voted U2 Band of the 80s. But it wasn't until 1987 and the release of their next studio album that they became the biggest rock band of the decade.
They finally really hit the mother lode with the Joshua Tree, which was an you know, an album so huge in the kind of mid to late 80s that it all but blotted out the sun.
And you give yourself away. And you give yourself away.
The Joshua Tree was a fascinating record because I think it really had its genesis in Bono's first meeting with Bob Dylan. U2 and Dylan shared the same bill at Slane Castle in Dublin. Bono got talking to Dylan, and it was Dylan who said to him, "You need to know where you've come from to know where you're going," and encouraged him to really look back at the heritage of rock and roll and where it had all come from. And that was a journey that naturally took them to Memphis, where it all started. And Joshua Tree really was their tribute to the wellspring of great American music.
The Joshua Tree is full of references to America and the landscape, and even the photo session, the Anton Corbijn taking them out into the desert. And they almost presented themselves as kind of this Shaker, Quaker, everything in black and white, everything kind of like a kind of a little spiritual colony out in the wilderness kind of thing.
The Joshua Tree was released on the 9th of March 1987. It instantly rose to the top of the charts and garnered the group many awards, including Album of the Year at the 1988 Grammys.
And it had a massive effect. World #1, 2 #1 singles in the States, cover of Time magazine. But more than this, it established them as the U2, which is iconic. They then found themselves suddenly, they were the top of the tree. They were the establishment. Uh-oh. It's all downhill from here unless we can think of a twist.
The twist they thought of was Rattle and Hum, an album which continued to explore the North American roots of popular music.
Rattle and Hum started life as a kind of a fairly low-budget tour film, and it was just essentially a record of the time. This is what it's like, kind of playing all around the world, and people really like us. They also kind of got into this exploration even more of kind of roots music.
It was a continuation, in some respects, of the Joshua Tree themes of the band searching for an identity, looking to American music, which had been European music's inspiration for the whole of the post-war era. They looked to that music to try and drive to the heart of it, literally drive to the heart of it, go around America and find the essence of American rock music and try and divine what that was, and sketch themselves into that tapestry.
The film, which had been conceived by the band as a low-budget tour movie, suddenly expanded into a major motion picture. This, coupled with the rather excessive elements on the companion album, began to attract a critical backlash from the press.
The thing about U2 is they've never done anything by halves. So if they were going to make this album about trying to explore the roots and the spirit of American music, then obviously it was going to be a million miles over the top, and it was. They recorded with B.B. King, they wrote with Bob Dylan, they wheeled in gospel choirs, they dressed up like cowboys, they wrote songs about Billie Holiday. I mean, it was all incredibly well-intentioned, as everything U2 do is, but it just came across as epically pompous.
The marketing of Rattle and Hum was everywhere. You know, they were on the cover of every magazine. They were doing all these simultaneous launches around the world. They were turning up at premieres and busking outside. And I think the world got heartily sick of U2.
Despite the record's problematic reception, it still became an extremely commercially successful album and garnered the group their first UK #1 with the single Desire. Despite these triumphs and being among the most important bands of the 1980s, U2 seemed to be in flux. They had exhausted their American musical journey and were beginning to receive negative criticism. It all came to a head at the end of the decade in Dublin.
They finished the 1980s with a series of dates at the Point Depot in Dublin, and there was a very famous night. It was New Year's Eve, 1989. And Bono did a big speech from the stage, and it was all something like, "We can't go on like this forever." And people almost thought he was kind of abdicating, he was going to break up the band.
Famously, at the end of the 80s, on the last night of the Rattle and Hum tour, Bono said to a crowd in Dublin, "You won't hear from us for a while. We have to go away and dream the whole thing up again." And that's where we come in.
U2 disappeared from public life and began the painful process of reinvention. It was clear that they needed a new direction, and a lack of cohesion threatened to tear the band apart. Eventually, they turned away from their much-laboured American influences and began to look east, towards Europe.
Having spent the past few years trying to locate themselves and replace their myth in the heart of American music, it was very natural and probably very correct for U2 to turn around and begin to look at Europe again.
It seems very counterintuitive that at a moment where everything seems to be in flux or chaos, is that a rock band seeking, one might suppose, a little oasis of creative calm would head straight for the centre of, if you like, of the turbulence of the times.
At the beginning of the 1990s, the Berlin Wall, which had stood as a physical manifestation of the ideological divide between the West and the communist East, was finally being torn down.
Berlin, at the moment they were recording the album, was probably the most exciting place on earth.